Hello, everyone. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. I am going to very quickly turn this over to my friend and colleague, Jean Navetta, to get us started because we are going to have a jam-packed show today.
Hey, Liz, how's it going?
I'm good, Jean Marie. How are you?
I am good, and I'm super excited about today's show, so thank you for getting it started.
You're welcome. Take it away.
Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Navetta. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. My pronouns are she and her, or if you speak Spanish, ella. And this is something to talk about. Every single week, we pick an article about something relevant to the LGBTQ plus and ally community, and then we invite guests on it to have a conversation. This week, we are talking about something very important and very, very timely. We are going to be talking about conversion therapy and sort of centering our conversation on the new film Pray Away that is on Netflix right now. So the article that we are using is available online. It came out of Refinery 29. Jean Hannah Edelstein wrote it, and it was called Conversion Therapy Hurts People, so why is it still around? If you want to grab that, definitely go to straightforequality.org/discussion series. But without further ado, I actually want to bring in our guests so they could tell you who they are and what their connection to this is. So I'd like to bring in Julie Rodgers, Christine Stalakis, and John Becker. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you all so much, and I appreciate what you're bringing to this conversation. So I have had the very good opportunity to get to know all of you, but I was wondering if we could do a very quick round and help people who are watching today understand what brought you into this conversation other than a pleading email from somebody at PFLAG. So Julie, if we could go first, you are in the film. So for those who haven't seen it, can you talk about your connection?
Yes, so I am Julie Rodgers, she, her, and I'm the author of Out Love, a queer Christian survival story. I am a participant in Pray Away. My story is a thread of a survivor of conversion therapy. And it's been incredibly powerful to be a part of this movement of really, I think, raising awareness for so many people about how prevalent conversion therapy is today and where exactly it's happening.
Thank you. Thank you. And Christine, you were the director. Can you tell us a little bit about what connected you to the topic?
Yes. So hi, I'm Christine Stalakis. It's such a pleasure to be here, the director of Pray Away. And I came to this topic from a personal place. My uncle went through conversion therapy when he came out as trans as a child. I was raised Catholic, as was he, and he spent a lifetime getting the message from licensed therapists and religious practitioners that there was something sick and sinful about him. And he had honestly a really hard life and a lot of mental health challenges. Years later, I became a filmmaker, and he actually passed away a few weeks before I went to film school. So I decided I wanted to make my first feature about this movement that had really harmed him and harmed so many others, and really does continue into today, which is something we were just talking about, before we went live, that a lot of people really don't understand that this really does continue. So that's a little bit about what brought me to Pray Away, what brought me to getting to work with someone like Julie, which was just a complete delight, and what brings me to this conversation today.
Thank you so, so much. And John, so you weren't involved in the film directly, but you've been focused on investigating this and understanding this and talking about it for many years. So can you talk a little bit about your background relevant to this topic?
Absolutely. So I was raised in a rather progressive but a very religious household. So when I entered LGBTQ civil rights advocacy work, a lot of that work was at the focus at the intersection of religion and LGBTQ civil rights. And I've been working on conversion therapy issues, in and around conversion therapy issues, for about a decade. I started off with an organization called Truth Wins Out that fights anti-LGBTQ religious extremism and the Pray Away, the gay myth specifically. And I recently, when I started off with them, I actually went undercover at a Christian counseling clinic co-owned by Marcus and Michelle Bachman with hidden cameras, and helped to expose them for offering this dangerous, discredited so-called therapy that victimizes so many LGBTQ people. So that was 10 years ago now already. But yeah, I've been involved in this work ever since. And as somebody who has dealt with a whole lot of internalized religion-based self-loathing, self-harm, those type of things in my past as well, this issue really resonates with me. And over the course of this time, I've had a lot of chance to talk with survivors and to hear the impact it's had on their life. So I'm very, very passionate about conversion therapy and ending this spiritual abuse.
Thank you, John. Thank you. So, one of the things that I found really fascinating about the film was that it did make this a very current conversation. And right before we started, we were talking about how many people have a perception that this is something that it's a done deal. It only happened in the past. It does not continue on now. And I was mentioning the last few minutes of the film, I found them absolutely chilling because of how this has changed. The article actually notes that it seems like individuals involved in things like the Freedom March legitimately believe that they are helping people. And Julie, I would really love to hear from you on this one, because you have a very unique perspective in this, and that you were both on the inside, in these practices, and now you have that outside perspective. So how do you talk to people who are still doing this, who really do believe legitimately that they are doing the right thing, the thing that God intends?
Well, I think it's important first to understand that, so many of these people that are in leadership positions were sort of groomed from within, and nobody goes into conversion therapy and stays in conversion therapy if they have a community of people that love and accept them and support them exactly the way they are. So they're in a small, closed community and they truly do not have access to people like you all who are going to affirm and delight in them. I hear from students who are currently at Christian colleges who don't know a single out openly gay person who is like healthy and well-adjusted and can sort of model what it looks like to just be like, a cat mom who's a lesbian in the world. And so they go to these organizations and they find people who say, God loves you, but you need to struggle against your sin, and we're going to walk with you in that struggle. And they at least get this sense of like, okay, well, I get to talk about my same-sex attractions and in the tiniest little way be a little bit gay and find other people who are also a little bit queer, even if they call it something different. And initially that sense of acceptance can feel better than all of the other people in their life, where they're like, oh, you don't think I'm completely repulsive? And it's such scraps that people are settling for because of the homophobia that's so rampant in their broader community, that they often don't start to see the effects of it until several years down the road, when they find themselves self-harming, when they find themselves caught up in really self-destructive cycles.
Wow. Christine, I want to ask you, because you spoke to people who were involved with the Freedom March. The scene where everybody's gathering in DC really, really stuck with me. What was your experience with them? I mean, what did that conversation sound like? We saw a little bit of it, but I was absolutely fascinated by this gathering that I think, looking from the outside, I would have assumed it was one thing, and it was absolutely the opposite of that, which is heartbreaking. So what was it like in those rooms with these people in 2021?
Overall, I would just say, when I first thought about making this film, I assumed, like a lot of people, that people running conversion therapy organizations were straight homophobic and transphobic people that were teaching LGBTQ people to hate themselves. And for me, the big realization of my research and then getting to make this film was that the vast majority of people that run these organizations are actually LGBTQ people themselves, who have internalized all the things Julie just spoke so eloquently about: this homophobia, this transphobia, John, you mentioned, this religious trauma, this self-hatred. And I've talked about this a lot, but it's really true that our film is really a study of what internalized oppression looks like when it's wielded outward. We spend a lot of time with leaders and former leaders in our film. So in terms of specifically spending time with the Freedom March, I respect that the way I'm talking about what they're doing is not how they view themselves. And I respect that a lot of people truly believe that they have changed in some way. And that gives me compassion, a lot of compassion, knowing that this really is a movement of hurt people hurting other people, that they grew up in the environment that Julie described. And it was an emotional roller coaster to spend time in those spaces, because I also have lived the pain of this movement, the way in which these messages, the way in which conversion therapy is practiced in the LGBTQ movement, that can look like a one-on-one conversation with a therapist, but it can also look like a one-on-one conversation with a pastor, like a peer support group meeting that becomes a sort of prayer revival like you see in Pray Away. I've seen the way in which, however it's practiced, this movement causes tremendous harm harm and trauma that stays with you in some way, sometimes your entire life. Not that you can't leave this movement, not that you can't heal, not that you can't find joy and love and affirmation, all of those things. Hope is absolutely on the other side of this for people who might be listening who are in this, but it does cause pain and trauma. So, you know, holding those two things, the compassion, the understanding, that we live in a broader world that teaches people that being LGBTQ is a sickness and a sin still, and the fact that this world causes tremendous damage. You know, it was a roller coaster, and we really tried to capture that roller coaster in our film.
And I think you really did. I mean, I think it's very difficult to watch it. I have been talking to a lot of people lately about the film, people who have watched it with all different levels of background. And everybody that I have spoken to has singled out one of the people that really resonated with them. And everyone has universally said something to me about it must be so isolating and so lonely to be like that. And I think that emerges in what you've done. John, you know, we're kind of talking about some of the damage that can happen to people when they are in these programs. And you've certainly seen a lot of this. You've seen it sort of in those formal settings. So the Bachman setting, for example, but you've also seen how this has played out in communities and the way it's shown up. Can you talk to people about what you have seen from the victims of this practice? How has it affected them? I mean, certainly medical associations have talked about this, but what has your real in the trenches experience been?
Absolutely. So to the question of what I would say to folks who feel like they're helping, that's exactly what I would say to them is because like we're saying, there's compassion that's needed, but what I would say to them is to listen to survivors. Pray Away shows so vividly what happens when leaders listen to survivors. That the scene, the Our America with Lisa Ling special, where Julie and Randy and Alan Chambers of Exodus sat down and had to reckon with survivors and to hear their trauma, to hear their pain, that is so powerful, because it does, like we were saying, it often leaves lifelong scars. The Family Acceptance Project out at San Francisco State University has a lot of compelling research about family outcomes in terms of what if LGBTQ people are affirmed and accepted and embraced by their families, and what that leads to in terms of anxiety, depression, and suicide. And Caitlin Ryan, who's the head of that project, has also done research into conversion therapy, and the statistics are just astounding. Such high rates of self-harm, of negative mental health outcomes. People and survivors that I've spoken with, yes, they report those things. They report some roadblocks to forming trusting relationships. It really messes with your mind, because in those situations you're setting people up. You're telling them that you need to change something that intrinsically cannot be changed. So you're setting them up to fail. And when they do invariably fail, because it can't and doesn't need to be changed, you're not just letting yourself down, you're letting down God.
Yes.
The psychological burden of that is like Yvette says in the film, it crushes souls. And I think that's what I would say to people who are still in that movement, who think that they're doing well, is to listen to the survivors, because when you do, you hear that it can crush the soul.
I often sort of think that it's helpful if you have a faith lens in many of these conversations, because I think someone who doesn't understand what it's like to be raised in a religious environment and with faith doesn't completely understand how serious it is when somebody tells you and you believe them that God is not going to love you unless you change. And it is such a profound thing to think about. And yet I don't know if you've been in that environment, if you can completely understand what a big role that plays. So Julie, I'd love to hear from you. Given all of this, understanding the situation that many of the people who go through this, what their background is, how can people do a better job in supporting survivors? Because there are more people out there, I think, than we know who have gone through this, whether it is in a really intense way or is it in a sort of lighter touch, a more pastoral counseling. But what should people do, and what do they need to keep in mind when they're working with survivors?
I mean, I would say, first of all, know that probably there's a good chance there are currently people around you who are actually involved in some kind of conversion therapy program. So just being mindful of how you talk about and what kinds of resources you're sharing in your immediate circles. It's so important that these people who are in these communities get to hear a continual message that they can come out, tell the whole truth about themselves, and have a positive future in a community where they're loved and wanted exactly the way they are. It's important for them to know their faith communities if they want to hold on to their faith. Any expression of faith, there are all kinds of churches and pastors and organizations who enthusiastically welcome and celebrate and delight in LGBTQ people. For those who are already out and on the other side of it, I think, I try to tell people just like have so much grace and compassion and understanding, like I spent from the age of 16 until my mid 20s in basically a cult that taught me upside down ways of seeing relationships, of seeing myself, of understanding intimacy and desire in bodies. And so I carry the scars of that with me into my mid 30s now, where literally and figuratively. And I think I would hope that people, both in the queer community and straight folks and allies, would just lead with compassion wherever survivors are. And wherever they are in their journey, they just need to know that they're seen and loved and accepted and supported.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a lot of moves legislatively to ban conversion therapy, and it is kind of hard to pin down because outside of more traditional settings, the legislation can be a little tricky. And there's stuff still happening in faith communities, and we all know that. And that's actually one of the things that you get into. Christine, do you think that changes to laws, so states that are banning conversion therapy, especially it's typically aimed at youth, do you think that this plays a big role in changing what we are seeing out there? Or do you think that this movement is evolving so it sort of can evade some of the laws?
I think the answer is complex, and the answer is yes to both of those things a little bit. We need the bans. Licensed practitioners do continue to practice this, and the bans are key to stop some people from going through conversion therapy, and the bans also help raise awareness that this is still happening. So that is an easy way to plug into local activism if you are wanting to try to do your part to help end this. This is getting banned on the local and state level, and we need that to continue. And we know that the majority of conversion therapy takes place within religious institutions, protected in our country and in many other countries by religious freedom protections. And those are robust protections in our country. So that means where conversion therapy happens most, where Julie went through conversion therapy, if a ban gets passed in Texas tomorrow, it will not touch the organization that Julie was a part of for a decade. So we also need a hearts and mind shift. We need a dialogue. We need to have a shared understanding that this is not a political issue. There's no us versus them. There's no two sides here. Conversion therapy is harmful. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work. Forget that. To me is like the least interesting part of what we need to talk about. It's incredibly damaging. We know this. It's a fact. It's just a fact. And I'm moved by this idea of listening to survivors. I completely agree. We have to acknowledge that people's pain that went through this, it's real. It's real. And we need to come together and say, we can't stand for this. And that means a dialogue in church communities and religious communities and conservative communities. That means recognition by religious communities that they might be practicing conversion therapy. They might not call it that, but it doesn't matter what you call it. You might call it pastoral counseling, like a conversation around sexual brokenness. It doesn't matter what you call it. If you're sending a message to a kid or an adult that being LGBTQ is a sickness and a sin, you're practicing conversion therapy and you have to stop. So, I think that we have to, I'll say this, with our film, our greatest hope is that we can help start that dialogue, that we can touch the places laws cannot. But we need both things. We need to work legislatively to end this, and we need to work culturally to end this.
John, I'm seeing you nodding your head and smiling. Do you want to build on that? Because you're certainly in the advocacy space. How do you think this changes, and how do we address these evolving challenges, I think, that we're seeing with this?
I think that, it's so important. Like we've been saying, to listen to survivors. I think about PFLAG. It's such a uniquely positioned organization because PFLAG PFLAG has love at the center. You go to pride parades and PFLAG gets some of the loudest cheers because it's about families, it's about advocacy, it's about affirmation. And I think that I'm guessing that many people who are watching are PFLAG parents, PFLAG affiliates, and what I would say. One of the things I would say first is just to remember, because, for parents naturally want to soothe and to comfort, and that's important. But so many times these survivors, because of what they've been through, are rightfully, understandably angry, and so it's important to just give space, just listen, just understand them. Don't try to manage their feelings. Resist the urge to say you need to forgive. Like, for some people, they're not there. Just let people be where they are. They in any situation where there are victims, center them in their experiences. Other things that can be done in terms of logistically and organizational level: invite survivors to speak at your meetings. Insist that survivor perspectives are heard whenever these issues are discussed. You could host screenings of Pray Away in your meetings, and or go to your churches and ask your pastors, because exactly as has been said here, it's so important. Queer kids are always going to be born into faith communities all across the spectrum. It's so easy for people who are in progressive, affirming communities to say, "Oh, just leave," but that's not enough. We need to be doing outreach into those spaces. We need to be meeting people where they are, because that's the work that saves lives. My mom was a Catholic liturgist all the way up until her retirement, and she was out and proud as an ally. And I love her, and I'm grateful to her for many reasons. But one of them being that had there been someone like that for me when I was growing up, it would have saved me a suicide attempt. So find ways in your churches, wherever they are on the ideological spectrum, if you feel safe, if you feel comfortable, find ways of showing LGBTQ youth that you're there and that they're okay, because that message that Julie says about you're fine just the way you are, that could save a life.
Yeah, I so appreciate what you're saying. And I think the visibility of people who care is so important. I remember years ago when we used to organize PFLAG chapters to show up at some of these events, and the parents would be out there with their signs telling people, "We love you just the way you are." And it was unbelievable to watch, especially the young people, walk out of these events and see those parents as they were walking alongside the parents that forced them into the event. And it was one of the most moving things I think I've ever seen in my entire life, not just my time at PFLAG. Julie, you mentioned something that kind of stuck in my head, and I want to ask you a question about it. And it was about that there are lots of affirming faith communities. Do you think that as more faith communities kind of have their reckoning about acceptance, and as they become more actively accepting, that too will be a lifeline for some people who are at risk of getting pulled into this?
I think it's absolutely a lifeline. And I also think it's just as important that people like who are listening right now, who are in a church, if they don't know what their church teaches, ask them, ask the leadership, and get a clear answer on what they believe about LGBTQ dignity and same-sex relationships, and the full affirmation of every queer person. Because if a church isn't clear that they celebrate and delight in us, then they likely don't. And if your church has a recovery group or a support group for people struggling with, they are likely practicing conversion therapy, and then leaving those churches, taking their money away, saying, "I know you're hip, I know you're cool, I know that you say you love everyone, but I can't be a part of something or give my money to something that isn't fully affirming and supporting these beautiful people." And so I think it's yes, those churches and faith communities can make an enormous difference in the lives of people who are currently, vulnerable to conversion therapy. And I also think there being like a movement away from conservative churches toward that will be a big part of helping those spaces gain momentum and gain visibility, so that these queer people can find them in the first place.
I'm glad that you brought up the point, and all of you have kind of touched on this about asking the questions in your faith community, because I do think I have seen many, many examples of sort of cooler, hipper evangelical churches that look very accepting, and that is not unintentional in any way, some of which have shown up at pride celebrations, inviting people to come to church, and this is what they are met with. So I'm so glad that you raised that. I know that we had a question. Liz had mentioned, Liz just messaged me and said that we had a question from one of the viewers, and here it is. So how can those of us not involved in religious communities locate people who practice conversion therapy? And that is from a PFLAG mom, which means they're not messing around. Any suggestions on this, how you can identify where this might be happening? Root these organizations out, how you might know if it's happening in your community. And I'm going to actually see, John, could you, because I know you've done some research into specifically strategies on that. Do you have any suggestions on that?
Well, first of all, I'm smiling because I wanted to give a shout out to Annette. She's with this PFLAG mom, so it's so wonderful to see her here. And I think that the film alludes to this, and in interviews with Julie and Christine that I've read, that they've both spoken about this, where part of the problem is that as awareness grows about conversion therapy and sort of the rightful popular revulsion towards it as the response, many of these organizations go underground. So it's a lot more difficult to track. I mean, and even when back in 2011, when I was doing the Bachman sting, I had to they were denying that they were doing it. So that was why we were asked by reporters, like, hey, do you know anything about this? And I had to actually call them up and pretend to be somebody who was seeking to change my orientation for them to slot me in with a therapist. So it's not always easy to find out, especially with, like you said, these sort of slick mega churches that bury the information on their websites, things like that. But Julie made a point earlier that because this practice has victimized so many people, 700,000, I believe, is the stat at the end of the film. Chances are there are people around you in your community that have gone through this. So that would be my first suggestion is just to listen, start those conversations. This film can be a jumping off point to start those conversations because, a lot of times people have that buried trauma and maybe felt comfortable and safe talking about it. But I would just start with that, with listening in your communities. And if you feel like going gangbusters and doing some research and calling around and things like that, by all means, you can also ask your local LGBTQ organization because they tend to have their fingers on the pulse of that as well. But yeah, I would just like I've been saying this whole time, start with conversations, start with listening to survivors and see where that takes you.
Christine, you the focus of this film primarily was the United States. It looked at mostly churches there. Did you see anything happening internationally? Because I certainly have seen pretty big reports of this spreading around the globe, and it is all in United States export. Was there any conversation about that during the work that you were doing?
Oh, yes. So one quick thing just to say, John spoke about a stat in the film about 700,000 people having gone through this. I just want to note that's in the US alone. Wow. So a lot of people have gone through this globally. We know that conversion therapy continues on every major continent. We know that when the largest conversion therapy organization, Exodus International, which we talk about in the film, closed down, that their international wing, Exodus Global Alliance, continued and continues to this day. There is conversion therapy all over the globe. And we end the film with this idea, and I really know this to be true, that as long as homophobia and transphobia exist in some way, something like Exodus, conversion therapy, all the things we have been talking about will continue. So if there is a community that has homophobia and transphobia in it, there will be something mixed in religiously, spiritually, and psychiatrically to look like a practice of conversion therapy that's going to send this message to LGBTQ people. So yes, it absolutely exists globally. I could talk more about that, but I would point people to our resource page for the film, where we have PFLAG, other partners that have talked a lot about the way in which this continues globally, which can give you some tools for recognizing it if you are listening and you are not a US, you do not live in the US.
Thank you. We only have a couple of minutes left. I would love to make sure that people know how to continue following the work that you're all doing. So Christine, could you just quickly remind people about how to find the film, and then we'll go to Julie and John too.
The film is on Netflix. We really hope that you check it out. It's on Netflix currently. And we also have a really incredible discussion guide for free on our website. If you're looking and having that community screening, that conversation that John and Julie have been talking about in your local church, your local community, that can help guide you and give you some more context for all the things we've been talking about, which is on our website, www.prayawayfilm.com.
Thank you. And Julie, if people want to know what you've been up to in your work.
JulieRodgers.com or places like Instagram and Twitter. Just search for me, and you can also follow the Out Love Project and then Pray Away. And those are kind of where I'm throwing all my energy and time right now.
Thank you. And John, how do people follow what you're doing?
Absolutely. So in my professional life, currently, I work in the reproductive justice movement, but I still am involved very, very strongly avocationally in LGBTQ civil rights issues. And the best way to track me on that is to track me on social media, Facebook and Twitter, and Instagram a little bit. I'm an old millennial, so not quite as some of the other. Yes, Facebook and Twitter.
Thank you so much. Julie, Christine, John, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for the incredible work that you did on this film and for the conversation that you are making happen that needed to happen for a long time. Thank you so much. And we hope that you'll come back and let us know how things are going and how stuff is changing. So thank you for your work.
Thank you so much. It's an honor
Thank
to be
you.
here.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Well, that gets us to the end of another really, really good show. Thank you for being with us this week. As a reminder, if you need help, please go to pflag.org to find your local chapter. As we wrap up the same way every single week, please run fast, laugh hard, and be kind. And most of all, please get yourself vaccinated. Wear masks if you are supposed to wear masks. We really want to be together again sometime soon. We'll see you all next week on Something to Talk About Live. Bye, everybody.